A few months ago, I was home at my parents' house, and I was relaxing on the couch, and my mother said to me, "Gerald, I really want you to listen to this homily we heard at Mass last weekend." So I sat there, and I said, I hope it's not boring. I didn't say that out loud. But actually, live streams are pretty good because if you hear something that's helpful, you can go back and listen to it again. And if it's helpful for you, maybe it's helpful for someone else and they can share it with you. So I said, "Okay, Mom, let's give it a listen." She started playing the homily, and the priest's message that day was about reconciliation. And he began by telling a story that I thought was so powerful. He was talking about his family, and I might be getting some of the details wrong, but I think it was the generation above him, as his, aunts and uncles and parents. And among them, there was an unmarried aunt who died, leaving no children. And when the time came for them to read the will, the family gathered. And again, I don't remember all the details, but I think all of the siblings were grown and well established, except for the youngest, who was still struggling to finish school and to start a family. Well, everything, as it turns out, that was in the estate, which I guess wasn't much, was left to that one brother. And upon hearing this among the other siblings, it was, or at least among half of the siblings, it was like a veil descended upon them. They shut down, they went cold, and then half of them stood up and said, "Okay, we're done here," and left. And then the priest said with a heavy heart that even though they lived in the same area, that was the last time that they were all together. Maybe something like this, maybe not as extreme, but something like this has happened in your family or in the family of someone who's close to you. I know in my own family, something happened decades ago. And then from that point onward, our family parties got a lot smaller. Growing up, I had cousins that I used to see every week. And then when something happened, it was like basically we had lost all contact with them. And the saddest part? I've tried to, from time to time, to find out what was the root of this wound. What caused this rift? And no one seems to remember. I've heard this referred to as Irish Alzheimer's. Now, I'm not Irish, but someone who is Irish told me that, so. And they said the idea with Irish Alzheimer's is that you forget everything except the grudges. But if we're to put it another way, it's not that you so much hold on to the grudges. Rather, it's that the grudges hold on to you. Again, I hope not, but I'm sure some of you have experienced things like this in your own family. And I know one of my grandmothers is 97. And all of the health, that's not her worry. The only thing that causes her sadness is that some of her children aren't talking. The reality is this: as nice of an image that I tried to project, and maybe as nice of an image that you tried to project, the fact of the matter is we are all broken. And sometimes our brokenness causes friction with the people we should love the most. It's funny. The people who can really hurt us the most are the people that we're the closest to. They might know the things that make us tick, or they can say those things that get under our skin in the wrong way. I don't remember what I said in my first confession, but I bet a part of it was fighting with my brother and maybe not listening to my parents. The simple truth is this: sin divides. Sin divides. Now, a sin is a thought, a word, or an action that's against God's law. And maybe you remember from your catechism class that there are two types of sins. There are the sins of commission, that are the things that you do, and then there are the sins of omission, that is when you don't do the good that you should do. But in whatever type, sin divides. Sin puts up walls between us and God, and sin also puts up walls between us and the people we should have good, strong, and healthy relationships with. And it's been like this well, since the fall of our first parents in the garden. At the beginning, God said, it's not good for man to be alone. We are made for communion. We are made for connection with God. And we are made for connection with others. Think about what happened in the garden. They had that sin, and immediately they were distanced from God. And not only were our first parents distanced from God, they were distanced from each other. And they began to play the blame game. It's your fault. And then this began to, not just with them, then it went on to their children. And we saw this in a very terrible way. Cain killed Abel. Sin divides. We see this in ourselves, in our own selfish tendencies, in our anger, and we see the impacts in our families, in our community, and then on the global stage, we even see this in war. Sin divides. But love unites. We saw this most spectacularly on Good Friday, when Jesus took the full weight of our brokenness on his shoulders, when he mounted the wood of the cross, and he stretched out, as it were, his arms between heaven and earth. And he offered himself in the greatest act of love in all time, so that we who are separated from God might be brought close. Love unites. But again, it didn't end there. Easter Sunday followed Good Friday, resurrection time. And the resurrection time, it shows us Jesus' power, for sure. It shows us the new life that he wants us to have. But more than that, it shows us that Jesus is alive and that he continues his work of reconciliation to our very day. In fact, there was an amazing example of this in the gospel that we just heard. So the gospel from today, it starts on the evening of that first Easter Sunday. So the disciples, minus Thomas, they were behind locked doors. And I think those locked doors are a metaphor for the times that we close and lock our hearts. But Jesus enters anyway. And that's a poignant reminder that Jesus can touch even the hardest heart. So what does Jesus say to those disciples when he enters? Those disciples who are there crouched in fear. Does Jesus point out everything that they had done wrong in their time together? Does Jesus say, "Why did you abandon me in my hour of greatest need?" Did Jesus call out their lack of faith? Did Jesus bring up past hurts? No, he looked past all of that, and he looked at them with all of the love in the world, and he said, "Peace be with you." And then we read, he showed them his hands, and he showed them his side, and in a moment, those disciples went from fear to faith. I think it's interesting that Jesus chose to keep his wounds after he rose from the dead. He could have had any glorified body he wanted, but he chose to keep his wounds, I think, because for him, the wounds weren't marks of shame or defeat, but rather they were the marks of love. And they were a lesson for what love does. Love gives of itself. Love sacrifices even when it hurts. And in showing us his wounds, Jesus makes it okay for us to show him our wounds. And then the gospel continues, and as it continues, Jesus commissioned these apostles to continue his ministry of reconciliation. We read, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained." The sacraments are the outward signs instituted by Christ to give us grace. And whenever you receive a sacrament with faith, you can be sure that God is going to give you the grace that he's promised. The sacraments give us certainty. And the sacrament of reconciliation is the privileged place where we can experience and receive God's forgiveness and his mercy. When you make a good confession, you can be sure that God has, in fact, forgiven your sins. And for me, I cannot tell you the number of times that I've made a confession, and then in doing so, how unburdened I felt. And for me in my ministry as a priest, it's such a privilege to help people have that same experience of forgiveness and being unburdened. Oh, and by the way, we're having confessions this afternoon. And we'll have a couple of extra priests here, so if you were looking for an unfamiliar face, there will be some there. If it's been a while or you don't know what to say, don't worry. You can ask the priest to guide you through, or in the back of the church on one of the tables back there, we'll have some of the guides that you can look at that could walk you through. The church teaches that we should make a good confession about once a year. I don't think this is an empty rule just to make us do something we don't want to do, but I think it reflects a wisdom that has a couple different facets. I mean, one obvious facet is that we're broken and that we keep sinning, and since we keep sinning, we keep needing forgiveness. Okay, that's there. But I think the second and the more profound facet of this wisdom is that when you have the experience of receiving God's mercy, you are then made more ready to extend that mercy to others. When you have the experience of receiving God's mercy, you are then made more ready to extend that mercy to others. And if you have loved ones, sooner or later, you're going to need to forgive. I know a priest who once told me, he said, "Gerald, a lot of people think I take the easy way out by only preaching about love. But what they don't understand is that love is hard." And then he said, "I have 8 brothers and sisters, and I still talk to each of them. Do you think that's easy?" So in that homily that my mother made me listen to a few months ago, the priest ended by saying that a group of these separated siblings all happened to bump into each other at a funeral. And then at that funeral, they started talking again. And even in that case from my own family that I shared, someone got sick a few years ago, and, we're still praying, but at least a few of them are talking again. Sin divides, but love unites. So my challenge for you on this Divine Mercy Sunday is to make it a point to experience God's forgiveness for yourself so that you can then extend that same forgiveness to others. Because just imagine what impact that could have in your family, in your community, and even in our world.